Hello and welcome to the bi-weekly meeting podcast for the OWASP Top 10 for Large Language Model Applications. If you'd like to stay up to date with our project, please click subscribe. And if you enjoy the content or have any questions, please feel free to comment and share. Now, on to our meeting.
All right. So we're going to go ahead and get started. So everybody, welcome to the core team meeting. I think this is the first time we've ever had a meeting of just the core team, but given the amount of discussions that have been going on the V2 brainstorming channel, I thought it would be good to get as many of us together as we could to talk through the options about how we approach the next phase of the project. While this is just a core team meeting, we are going to record this and we are going to post it for complete transparency. So everybody, please keep that in mind during the discussion. I want to make sure that this is available so that everybody can see it, so everybody understands the process that we're going through. But hopefully folks had a chance to maybe open the slides after I posted them last night. But I took a tour through the V2 brainstorming channel, which is public. Everybody can see it. There's a lot of good discussions going on there. I grabbed what I thought were the most interesting discussion threads. If there are ones that I'm missing, we can definitely add those to the agenda. But one of them, I just want to briefly go back through the data that we gathered from surveys so far, just to remind people about what the group broadly is thinking about V2. And then the discussions that came up were what was termed the weaponization discussion. Do we think it's appropriate to include any of those in the core top 10 list, or do we want to reference those off to maybe some of the other projects? There's some discussion around the relationship between jailbreaking and prompt injection. I'll highlight where some of that's coming from. There's a big thread going on around how do we want to discuss hallucinations and over-reliance and what's on top of what in that pairing. There's some discussion around agents and then also around RAG and embeddings. Are there any other big topics that folks think have surfaced in the discussion that we want to make sure we cover?
I think I'll just mention I've been trying to sort of peel off some folks that are talking about like deep fakes and some of the other things that are more around sort of adversarial uses of AI technology to that CTI layer that Sandy and I and my research partner Brian as well are sort of managing and working on a couple of projects with the intent of releasing guidance to the cybersecurity community, very similar to the things that Sandy had worked on before, providing some guidance around like how do you set up governance around this for if you're in cybersecurity, right? So yeah. I would just mention, you know, we have a CTI channel in the top 10 LLM sort of cluster of Slack channels. And we do have sort of a couple of pieces in motion there. So just to kind of, as we sort of think about where these things might want to live or where we might want to channel some of these really good ideas that are out there, that's a potential place that we could still deliver value to the community.
Yeah, so I think things along the lines of the deep fakes and other things fall broadly into that weaponization category. So let's come back to that in the agenda, definitely on the docket. Ads?
So I've always, so because we're LN applications in Gen AI, as that's our narrative as a project, I agree there's a need for that because we
Okay, I'm going to call a timeout. We're getting into the weaponization discussion and it's premature. I have sections for each of those, so we don't.
Totally fine. All my point is, if we're going to say deep fakes, we need to say something like safety, in my opinion, which is an overall concept of responsible AI rather than just deepfakes
Yeah.
and other
So
stuff.
at this point, all I want to get is, are there missing agenda items? I think what we do with weaponization topics like deep fakes, let's come to that because there is a slot in the agenda. So
Yeah,
Aubrey.
you're right.
Yeah, I was just going to ask about where I guess supply chain fits in with this list, or if it doesn't at this point.
So we'll talk briefly about supply chain when we do the data review. What I've seen is a lot of interest in supply chain and very little controversy. So I didn't add it to the list. It seems like that's just something that's still high on the priority list, but we can talk about that briefly as we get into the data review.
Okay, cool. The only reason I ask is because I mean that sort of jump was something that I expected to see, and it definitely wowed me.
Yeah, so let's get into this. Let's go and review some of the data, and I think this will get into Aubrey's question. When we go back to some of the surveys that we took several weeks ago, we asked people to re-rank the existing top 10. As Aubrey noted, supply chain, sensitive information disclosure, and excessive agency were all big movers up. I think that the topic of agents is one that we will hit specifically because there is a lot of discussion around how do we want to talk about agents? Do we want to wrap things into this excessive agency entry, or are there other entries that want to either subsume this or are in addition to this? So I think that's definitely a topic for today. Supply chain, my own impression of it is there were some good additions submitted to supply chain. They very much fell into the same categorization as the existing supply chain entry. There's been a lot of work done in supply chain. I think we just want to make sure that we have a really good team working on updating our guidance around supply chain, but I haven't seen much controversy. Anybody else have comments on this piece in terms of observations they want to make?
Yeah, I mean, I submitted the update 10.9, like the previous one. I think the previous entry highlighted the world as it was when ChatGPT came out, where the emphasis was on hosted models and components. The world has moved on. I think Hugging Face is becoming the place for supply chain issues, I think. And I try to do as much as I could for the entry. It isn't just the open access models that we see. We see new collaborative ways of working, like model merges. And Jason, I think you highlighted that. So I think these are things that we need to pay attention to because many people will start using it. So I wasn't surprised to see that people have interest in all that.
Yep. All right. Really quickly, when we get into the things people were interested in, relative to some of the discussions that are coming, well, honestly, there's not a lot of statistical differentiation between the top 4 or 5 here. The top 2 were autonomous agents and a RAG, and those are 2 of the discussion topics that have come up again in V2. So I think that's just worth noting that that's been very consistent. And I think as a group, we want to make sure that we're providing more guidance around those 2 topics that were very, very new when we published the first version of the list. Same thing here, sort of a bit different cut, but you see interest in agents, open source, open weight models, going back to that supply chain discussion. Anybody want to add an observation here on this data, how it might relate to topics we're going to talk about today?
I don't see how to raise hands. Sorry, guys.
Oh, go ahead.
I just wanted to add that the voting that happened for these entries was limited to the list of the entries, the new entries that we had in the GitHub, right?
Yes.
And like the original task for those submissions was to add new ideas. So when we will vote for the new things that should be part of the top 10, we should kind of unite both lists, right? And think about categorization and what becomes part of what, whether we merge or branch out some things.
Absolutely. And I think that is the core of a lot of what we want to discuss today. This round, in terms of what we're doing the next couple of weeks will not result in a new top 10 list. This will result in some kind of whittled down thing that will lead to the next set of activities that will get us there, and that will have to account for the current top 10 and some set of the new entries that we want to move forward. Rachel.
Yeah, I was sort of interested in the LLMs that generate code aspect of it. Did we get any like comments around that? I'm kind of curious if this is falling more into like incorrect or over reliance or like adversarial use. So I was just kind of curious where that comes from.
I think this was one part of a larger survey that we did. It was intended for general guidance on topics we might delve into. So I don't think we have a lot about what's under it.
Got it.
Jason.
Just the interesting thing to me about this graph is if you look at it, it's easy to think like, oh, people cared less about LLMs to generate code until you realize that the critical bars, people were putting LLMs to generate code critical on the same level as like RAG.
Yeah.
So that disparity is a little interesting.
Okay. Look, I think this is another one. This does go back to some of the discussions that we subsequently had around the charter, but it's a good reminder there is going back to Jason's point about the critical bar, data privacy, top of mind for everybody here. And I think very relevant to some of the top 10 entries. The other one that does have a very large green bar is the safety question. And so I think there is a lot of interest in safety. I think we've decided that broadly things that just fall into safety probably don't go in the top 10, but we're going to come back into that in some of the discussion around the weaponization topic. So this is a subset of the voting on the new entries. I think we had 34 of them. This is just the 10 that got the most votes. Note that there's no weighting between whether somebody voted this air quotes number 1 and number 5, and I didn't imply in the survey that was a weighted list. So if somebody voted for one with any of their votes, those are equal weighted. What was interesting is there was a new spin on prompt injection. I'm not sure people really looked at that one versus the other one, but it completely dominated the voting. So obviously people are still very interested in prompt injection. We're going to need to make sure that we do a good job there. The hallucination entry, which to some extent is a rewrite of over-reliance coming at it from the other direction in terms of what's the vulnerability, not what's the outcome, did get a lot of votes, and we'll come back to that as a topic. And then the last one I want to highlight here, bypassing of system instructions using system prompt leakage. There was a discussion just this morning that somebody brought up the fact that they hate the term jailbreaking because it gets used elsewhere. Whoever wrote this entry, and I don't remember off the top of my head who it was, but they seem to have gone to great lengths to avoid using the term jailbreaking here, but I'll use it. And I want to come back to that in terms of it's something that when you look at the way the original prompt injection was written, it was actually in many ways trying to capture jailbreaking, not what we've broadly referred to as prompt injection. So I think we've got some rationalization to do there. Ads.
Yeah, sorry, I actually had my hand up before and I forgot to lower it, but I think prompt injection is always going to be the hot topic because if anything, it's the most publicized critical thing, which is directly most commonly related to data leakage. Like, I don't know if anyone saw the Gartner report as well this morning. It was something like 35% of all companies that have implemented Gen AI have had a security breach. So I think what I'm trying to say is not to get too inflated with prompt injection, because I just think because it's the hottest topic and probably will be for a long time, doesn't necessarily mean that it's the biggest vulnerability.
Yes.
Fair.
Yes. It absolutely is, in my opinion, and I'm happy to make my argument.
I don't think we need to argue the ranking of prompt injection here. We know it's going to be on the list somewhere, and we'll get back to that at the right time. Jason.
I think I need somebody to explain to me how bypassing system instructions using system prompt leakage is not part of prompt injection.
We're going to get to that discussion topic.
Okay, cool.
Wait for it. Really quick, look at the bottom. The one thing I'll note, and this leads to the weaponization discussion. If you look down about midway, you see a deep fake threat on the top list. You also see it on the bottom list. So there were a substantial number of votes for people who wanted it on the list and a substantial number of people who wanted it excluded based on rules. And that is kind of the core of the weaponization discussion that we'll get into. So with that, let's dive into some of the topics. Fun with DALI. Here we go. So I grabbed Eugene.
Sharing the slide deck, Steve.
Oh, I'm not sharing the slide deck.
Yeah, you
Really?
are. Yeah,
you are.
yeah, I can see
Yeah.
it.
I see it.
I can see it.
Okay, let's
So
move on.
John, you might have gotten an upgraded Zoom client and not learned how to use it yet, but sometimes you have to, there's like 2 tabs at the top and you got to click one to see the
That's what it
slides.
is, and I apologize to the president. Okay.
I'm like, oh my God, I'm not sharing the slides. No, everybody at my office got confused by that for like a week when they changed that in the Zoom client. So, okay, so I grabbed Eugene's good quote here where I think he's done some nice work looking at them, categorizing things that fall in this. Eugene, you want to just add some commentary around this?
Yeah, sure. I actually wanted to add a comment to the previous slides, but you don't have to go back.
Okay, go ahead.
The idea is that the people who vote, they don't know the decision making we have the top 10 list, right? We don't communicate who is the target audience and what is the operationalization of those entries is, right? So when we ask, and within this survey, when we ask whether deepfake is a real threat, of course, many people approve it, right? But it doesn't mean that it's necessarily part of the top 10 list, right? So there is a difference between what we want to see in the list and what is important, AI security risk or AI safety risk. And with that in mind, as a product person, I always keep the target audience in mind. And I have these categories or entries or classes of vulnerabilities that are actionable and usable, right? And I always group those based on the kind of security stories, job stories, jobs to be done. And these are kind of identical in terms of the audience, in terms of their nature of the threat. We have deployers of the systems, and they have risks, and we have consumers of the systems, and they have some risks, right? So essentially, the top 10 list is primarily built for deployers. It's usually developers or security engineers who need to do something to their systems to make them secure, right? And that's where we have this insecure plugin design and supply chain vulnerabilities and prompt injections. But then we have the entire different subset of target audience, which is about those who could become a victim of generative AI systems. And that's where we have this weaponization and, as it was mentioned, safety in general, right? So safety is about victims of or from Gen AI, and security is about protecting the asset, which is Gen AI system.
So other people, I think the crux of the issue here is to sum it up. When we look at entries like these, do we believe these or ones like them belong in the top 10 list, or should we look to take some of these very important topics, but exclude them from the top 10 list because the top 10 list is focused, let's say, more on vulnerabilities rather than adversarial uses of the technology, and maybe defer these off to some of the other assets, as Rachel had discussed earlier in the meeting. So anyone else want to make quick comments around that in terms of their opinions?
We actually could easily have like top 5, top 10, top 5, top 7 AI safety or weaponization issues.
And I think
with the similar kind of profiles, just not top 10.
John.
I was just gonna.
Oh, John first.
Okay.
I think that's where we need to. I struggle with that myself too, and I think that's where we need to find a consistent line as a security professionals of how we address abuse violations. So that's the term actually the NIST taxonomy uses. I think it's not like the old traditional IT system where we think, oh, you know what, safety has now to do with us. Actually, we're securing systems that can be abused in terms of safety. So we need to make sure that we provide some assurances, but it doesn't become actually a primary focus. So having a category of weaponization, abuse, and then capture all that. How, as a defender, I will stop my system being hijacked and be weaponized. And then as part of that, as a parallel thread, we expand that theme with more guidance. That would be my view.
Oh, wait, Sandy was next, even though she didn't raise her hand. Sandy.
Yeah, I know. I can never find that button. I just wanted to say that I completely align with Eugene's perspective on it. Like, this is we can't boil the ocean. Who's our audience? It really is the developers and people trying to implement these solutions. And, I completely agree that we need to talk about it. I talk about these things all the time, but there's a different place.
Okay, ads.
Yeah, completely +1 on what Eugene said. I think just a food for thought is like over-reliance and whether that is pushed into that as well. I know that's not like adversarial, but it kind of falls under trust and safety. Just literally thought.
Well, we'll come to over-reliance, separate topic. So I'm going to put a pin in that one.
We have to be careful.
If I just can take myself off mute. I just wanted to sort of +1 what John was saying. I think there's a difference between the OWASP sort of focusing on what are the things inside of our models and our development we can do to prevent these types of weaponization from occurring with our models. That's where our focus should be. In regards to like discussing how these are done and how you can detect them and things like that, that's, I think, more under that umbrella of the CTI work that we're doing, right? We're really trying to educate cybersecurity professionals, give them the tools to sort of recognize when these things are happening and what to do. So yeah, I agree with like sort of the distinction John was making there about sort of what the audience for the OWASP piece is. And then, we have this other body of work that these great ideas and this information could be useful to sort of a different target audience. Yeah.
Right. All right. I think what we're going to say here is effectively this motion carries. We're going to exclude these at least as top level entries. I do think John makes a good point where securing your models where they are hard to weaponize might be an interesting topic of discussion to sprinkle throughout other parts of the list. So it's something to keep in mind. It's not that we exclude all of these concepts, but these are not core vulnerabilities for the top 10 list. So let's keep going because we got a lot more to get through.
One quick point though, Steve.
Yep.
I think alignment value mismatch might need further discussion out of that list specifically, because I think that is different in a lot of ways than some of the other ones that are there.
Okay. All right, Eugene, you want to wrap this up then?
Yeah, it may be different, but probably like the content of the entry was somewhat related to how it was positioned.
Okay.
Well, I just want to say that we could prototype and kind of A/B test the demand for such entries. And while we have the formal official top 10 list of LLM security issues, we could also have on our official website a blog post about like top 10 LLM safety issues that didn't make it to the main list, and see compare the traffic.
I like that a lot, because I think there's some really quality work that's been done here. It's just basically excluded by rule from the core asset, but I think we need to find a way to carry this forward. So let's take that up as a topic.
Yeah, I think the one thing I would suggest too, I think that's a good idea. Some of these areas where we have that are kind of out of scope, it doesn't keep us from having some conversations about them in a more informal fashion. I think the blog idea is a good way to kind of still have a finger in it without disrupting the top 10 focus.
Yep. All right. So we're gonna have to keep things moving along here, but that was probably the longest discussion on the Slack channel, was the weaponization one, and I think we came to a good place. So let's talk about what I'm broadly calling jailbreaking, which is this bypassing systems instructions using system prompt leakage, and the broad prompt injection topic. There was a lot of discussion around this on the list. I would love to get comments from the team about how they view these. I cut off some commentary earlier, so I know people have opinions, but I wanted to get here and make sure it was in the right spot. So, Rachel.
Yeah, and I will unfortunately have to run to another meeting after this, so I'll be pretty quick about this. I did drop into the chat a conversation that we were having on Slack. Kirshna, I think, was in that conversation as well, and sort of where these fall under. What we sort of came to the conclusion of is, based off of some of the actual reports of these things happening, the system prompt leakage can actually happen without the user or actor intending that leakage to happen, right? And I actually liken it to like the other OWASP top 10 around application development, where we advise people, like, be careful of the robustness of your error messages and how that can lead to additional information, which will then allow to attack the system. So I think it's actually sort of two separate pieces. And I think there is actually a fair amount of guidance that we could provide and examples we could provide around that system prompt leakage issue. I know from having configured some prompt shield security tools for our AI models, how that could lead to some disclosure about how those security controls are implemented. So I do think it's valid, but I sort of urge people to take a look at that discussion and where some suggestions we had about how that half of this scenario could be actually included in some existing top 10 entries.
Okay, great points. Other comments on this one?
I think what you're describing, Rachel, is system prompt leakage, which is, in my head, a different issue than bypassing system instructions using system prompt leakage. That bypassing systems instructions implies, I think, input from the attacker, which then puts it into prompt injection territory in my head. So I'm still unclear about that. I agree system prompt leakage is an issue that probably is different and needs to be addressed. But I think that is different than bypassing system instructions using system prompt leakage, which is, again, prompt injection in my head.
Eugene?
I think many, including these disagreements, come from the situation where we have both techniques and attacks and scenarios and all these types of things in the same list, right? So it's not like a very strict taxonomy. And if we find a way to unite these things, it could be a great way, like malicious malicious input manipulation, something like this, could unite several entries. So we don't bring things from different levels to the top 10 list, right? So we could still consider any of these entries as valid, but some of them could become sub-entries or subclasses of scenarios, right? So it doesn't have to be a very specific prompt injection. Prompt injection may become a subclass of a bigger category that is a separate entry.
Anyone else want to make a comment on this one? All right, what I'll say that I took away, I think, was a really good observation. Maybe originally came from Rachel and then Jason piled on, was that if if we look at the really long title on this one and we break it up a little bit, and if you just look, for example, at system prompt leakage, there's a model of the universe where that is very distinct from prompt injection and maybe a really valid vulnerability. We would have to decide how it ranks. But I would like to take that away as an action item to explore. Can we tease apart sort of the system prompt leakage part from the prompt injection part and come up with a candidate we could evaluate along with the other ones? So let's take that as an action item and let's keep moving. Hallucinations and over-reliance. So here's the crux of it. Unfortunately, I don't think Krishna was able to join today, but we at least have his comments on it. But I'll speak to my piece of this, which is one of the two that I submitted was one that was focused. I think I gave it the title "Dangerous Hallucinations," which I actually don't like for various reasons. But the idea was to take over-reliance, turn it on its head, focus on hallucination as the vulnerability where one of the risks of it is people over-rely on it and you get into trouble on that on a number of axes, including opening yourself up to legal liability and other things like that. Versus over-reliance being the headline, which is, I think, the single reason that has consistently been the most controversial entry in the top 10 is people don't like it because it's not a vulnerability. It's an outcome. Krishna's, I'll let his comment here speak for itself, but I'd love to get some thoughts from the broader group about how we might want to approach this duality. And are these separate things? Are these one thing? Comments from anybody at the group here?
I will say, I've wrestled with we've argued about this one for over a year, and it is something that is one of the most referenced issues with LLMs. So from a developer standpoint, making sure that you say something like, please double check all of the references and confirm the validity of this response. LLMs are known to make mistakes, something like that. So I agree it's controversial, but I can talk myself into it and out of whether or not it belongs on the list.
John.
I would side with Sandy on this one. I think, to me, shows how much generative AI changes everything. I think, although I agree that we shouldn't become safety experts, and I like the conclusions we kind of wrote earlier on, we shouldn't carry on as business as usual, that AI doesn't change. I came out of a call earlier on from work where a developer was trying to convince some of the project sponsors that they shouldn't be using whatever comes out of the model without some critical thought. It was an interesting conversation. I think by having it there, although it's not a 100% security issue, we empower developers to have that conversation. It's something that I think is really, really important. And the problem with that, of course, we have is, with automatic agents, how do you then enforce that at scale? But that's a different conversation. So over-reliance as a term will come back to bite us perhaps a little bit, and maybe hallucinations is a better term in that, this is the danger rather than over-reliance, which may disappear.
Jason.
I think I agree with a lot of what's been said. And I've been a proponent of keeping over-reliance. I know this has been a hot topic since it was first introduced. I think it becomes more important as we see industry move towards automated agents and agentic solutions. That over-reliance is going to become critical soon, I think. So I think it's important to keep it for that reason.
Ads?
I think hallucinations is a better terminology for over-reliance. But hallucinations are just like a subset expected thing of LLMs. And is it really a developer thing, or is it more like a responsible AI thing, like legal and other departments in the enterprise.
So I'll just add my 2 cents there, having had to defend the over-reliance thing so much over the last year. And again, I think this is where there are people who say hallucinations are what they are. You can't do anything about them. I violently disagree with that. And I think we all would when it's phrased that way, because there's a lot you can do about them. There are all sorts of mitigation techniques. And I think we as developers need to put those in place, right? You can do fine tuning, you can add RAG, you can do better prompt engineering. There are all sorts of things you can do to minimize hallucination, which minimizes the damage that can come from over-reliance. And I think that's somehow the duality that we need to capture. Eugene.
I completely agree with what you're saying, but what you just said isn't a security risk, right? To an owner of the system, of a Gen AI system. And I think that it totally fits the place for safety issues, as we discussed previously, together with weaponization. It will go to the same level of weaponization, over-reliance. And I think we could break down over-reliance into safety and security issues because it's too broad at the moment. If we break it down, we can see like who is the victim of the hallucination. If it's an insecure, unstable code that is generated and automatically integrated into the application that we deploy, it could be a security risk. But if the only person or the only party who is suffering, who is the victim of this hallucination, is the end user, it's the safety issue, right? So if we break it down into technical hallucination, it's very close to insecure output handling or kind of vulnerable code that is part of their of the deployment, like vulnerable library, whether it's supply chain vulnerability or just insecure application, right? And the hallucination that is not that technical, but someone that may cause some harm, it's a safety issue. So we could break it down and make it more concrete.
Okay. All right. We've got 2 more hands up, which are Aubrey and John. So we're going to take those 2 comments and then we got to move on because we do have a number of other ones to cover. So Aubrey.
Just adding 2 cents really quick. I loved how Ads put it that it's a subset of hallucination, a subset of over-reliance. For me, it's one of a myriad of different reasons why over-reliance is a problem. So yeah, I'm all for keeping over-reliance as well.
John.
I think we can, that's primarily for you, Eugene. I think we can apply a very scientific definition of security and safety and do a disservice to those who build and defend systems. I think what we have done with including over-reliance is a massive cultural shift within cybersecurity, not to say it's not my problem. And I think I know it's not a technical, I know it's kind of traditional cybersecurity thing, and it's trustworthy AI, but we are part of trustworthy AI. And for that reason, I'd like really to keep it.
Okay. All right, we're going to move on. So let's talk about agents.
I like your graphics there.
So I grabbed one of John's comments, so I'm going to let John open the discussion here. But broadly, I think we want to talk about our strategy for approaching agents, which was something we largely excluded from the original list. So John, you want to open this up?
Yes, I think we touched a little bit on that. I think I don't know if Andy's on the call. We did some excellent work on excessive agency about the autonomy of the system at large. And then we also had conversations about plugins, which was another way of adding extensions, if you like, to the system. And then plugins became outdated. And I think, they're just part of OpenAI, really. We don't see them in other ecosystems that much. And then, and Sandy, I like the tutorial that you shared with AutoGen, where you start seeing autonomy, you start seeing agents that can do more than just execute commands. And I thought, in addition to the autonomy and the excessive agency, there are things like what are the attack vectors that we're introducing on that? And, there is the environment they interact with, there is the planning that they do. So we need to pay attention to that, and we need to understand. I'm not suggesting my entry provides the answers to that. I just wanted to start that conversation that isn't just the autonomy. There are different attack surfaces coming in with autonomous agents. And I'm not suggesting agents and plugins are the same thing. It's just I think mentally, when we address the extensibility of LLM systems, we focus on plugins that become outdated. And I think now the money is on agents. That's why I suggested that we replace that entry.
Right. Other people would like to comment on the agent topic.
I wonder if there's a way to abstract the risks. So like you mentioned, it started with plugins and now we've moved to agents, and plugins aren't as cool anymore, and now agents are the cool thing. I wonder if there's a way to abstract those risks, to generically talk about it, so that whatever version 3 of the cool thing is, maybe we'll have those same types of risks. Maybe we can proactively be covering those types of things.
Well, I think one of the important concepts that I think came out of the 1.0 list was this concept of talking about agency as a thing. And by not using the word agent, but talking about agency, I think there is something to be captured there. It's about brains versus fingers. A lot of what we're doing, we talk about, people talk about the reductive nature of a lot of these vulnerabilities is the only vulnerability that your LLM is going to call somebody a bad name, right? You go back to Tay and things like that. But when you give the LLM fingers and it can go manipulate your bank account or your stock trading app or somebody's medical diagnoses, it has agency, and that could be implemented through a Lang chain, a plugin, an agent framework. So I think there is something about how you attach the decision making here to the real world, and what are the vulnerabilities about the ways that you may do that may have things in common or may be different that I think are worth exploring.
I think there are two, and I think Jason and you, Steph, helped me actually see it clearer. I think both autonomous agents and the agency, and this, I think they describe two different areas of concern. One is the agency, the autonomous execution of things that we'll need to tap into more. But there is also, Jason, to your point, how do we extend the model? And what's the kind of the cool thing was plugins, nice autonomous agents that bring agency to. Maybe the insecure plugin design becomes a secure extensibility design or something along those lines.
Other comments on this one?
Ads and I were chatting just a little bit about, insecure plugin design and excessive agency sharing, two individual entries in the chat. However, I mean, one thing I want to note is that if you think about insecure software design, that could potentially encompass both rather than insecure plugin design. I mean, I think we can all agree that a model can directly have agency built into it.
Yeah.
So,
or maybe insecure integrations or something like this.
Yeah, no, I think making it just a secure software design is too generic. I think it's how do we extend and integrate with the model, and whether we call it integration or extensibility, I don't mind.
Okay. So
yeah, I tend to like the extensibility kind of approach to it.
Well,
and then a breakdown.
Move on, but I think what we're hearing from the group is that there's less controversy on this one, in that we know we want to include more in the list about this, and what we've got ahead of us is some work to do in terms of that. John, would you be willing to take a bit of leadership on this, maybe spin up a channel and invite people into that discussion? You can use your existing entry as kind of fodder for that, but let's see if we can bring about some ideas from the team about the best way to do this.
I'm happy to collaborate with everyone else who's interested in. I'll invite you all anyway.
Great. All right.
Emmanuel had his hand up. Emmanuel, did you have your hand up, or is it just an old hand?
Oh yeah, I just want to comment. It's okay. I just want to comment, like within all of these discussions, very important also, like how we position ourselves, because our charter it's towards developers. So how are we approaching disclaiming that we suggest building left instead of shifting left, because all of these vulnerabilities can start early on, and if we suggest mitigations and how to approach these things early on can be very effective.
I think one of the things, we should go double check the charter on this, but I think one of the things that we did tune up, just sort of based around our actual audience, is that this is not really targeted at developers per se, but development teams building things. And that's going to include everybody from product management to data science to AppSec to developers who write code. And I think we need to understand that everybody in those audiences needs to be involved here, or we're not going to get secure systems. So we should go back and double check the charter and make sure that it reads like that. What I have found interesting is that we definitely did position the first version of the list that way. It appeared to deter nobody from adopting it. But it did leave an opening for people like Sandy to come in and make guidance that was explicitly for a different group like CISOs, and they ate that up too. So we'll have to figure out how we want to tune the audience.
Yeah, I would say also that we're seeing this being used while the focus has been around development, application development around LLMs and the security of that. The adoption, as you said, has been much more broadly taken on by other audiences as a framework. And so, yeah, it's our focus. We just have to think about what other audiences make sense.
All right. So RAG and embeddings. So I tried to come up with a picture of something retrieving data, and what we got was a robot dog with Japanese characters written in green, which I'm enjoying very thoroughly. But let's talk about this one. So I grabbed a comment from Bob, who's always been very active in the group. And this one was focused particularly on this idea of things like embedding inversion. I'll let everybody read this. I won't read it, but I go back to some of the earlier things that it seemed like more specific guidance around RAG in general was a top area of interest for people. There are some of these things that, very much these were just not topics a year ago when we started. So I'd love to get people's thoughts either on Bob's comment here or more broadly in general. How do we deal with things like RAG and embeddings and some of these patterns that are becoming very common in LLM app development that we just haven't covered in the past? So I'll open it up for comments.
I definitely agree with Bob's statement there. I think this also touches on poisoning, because by the time the model's deployed, the poisoning, you're past that point, right? So how poisoning happens now is by injecting content into that RAG database, which is probably less secure than the model environment. So I think there's a lot of worth in evaluating this. I don't know that it makes, again, I'm just thinking of future proofing. Right now, RAG is the hot topic. So everybody was like, yes, we want to hear more about RAG, but what's it going to be tomorrow? I think it's still going to be some kind of our data is stored somewhere else and we're providing that as context. But I think we need to see if we can abstract that to kind of future proof for whatever the next hot thing is.
Yeah, I'll just, actually, let's let people go through here. So John.
I agree with Jason there. And I think, we assume that RAG and embeddings is something that's happening in parallel as part of the main flow. But in reality, generating embeddings uses probably a different model, probably a different API. So I'm not convinced it needs to be a different entry, but it does need some guidance of how we safeguard that workflow and the storage of embeddings, for all the reasons that comment has in there.
Okay, so I'll just add my comment. I see two things that we're talking about that are maybe a bit distinct. One of them is around, somebody used the term poisoning here, and I think, we've already talked earlier in the group, and I think Ads has already kind of rebranded what was originally training data poisoning to just data poisoning. And, if you're bringing in a data set from somewhere that you're retrieving against and that is poisoned, that puts you at risk. I don't think we have that guidance in there yet today. I think that's a big opportunity. This one, the way I read this one is it's less about the risk of somebody poisoning you with bad embeddings. It's more about the risk of having the content of your embeddings extracted, which opens you up to PII leakage, data leakage, intellectual property threat, things that in the 1.0 list we probably broadly categorized with I'm trying to remember what the term we used, but there was basically one that was sensitive information disclosure. And I don't think any of these concepts are at all captured there. You could fold some of this into that, or maybe this is a different top level thing. So love to get some comments on that, but I see Eugene has his hand up.
Yeah, I actually had exactly the same point as you mentioned. It's RAG is a design pattern, and it has two main scenarios related to security. One is about, like, I would say 80%, 90% is about data exfiltration, and probably 10% is about using it as a temporary or kind of runtime memory for the real operations, which potentially may become a part of the training data set. It could be poisoned, right? But I would say that I'm completely with you on that, that it's more about retrieval of information rather than kind of pipeline for training.
Anybody else want to add comments on this one?
Just to reiterate what I said, I don't think it's kind of a different thing. Even if we see it as both poisoning and retrieval, I think it's about education, because we always assume RAG just happens in the background. Now that more and more people use, they include new steps that increase those risks, and we need to highlight them in the poisoning and disclosure entry, which I keep forgetting to.
Yeah, I guess I'll put out a question, and we don't have to come up with a clean answer to it here, but I'll see if people have a feeling about this. Do people feel like we don't have, even in this candidate list, what I'll call is a clean, good candidate for places at the top level to put concerns around RAG? Do we think that there's potentially a place on the top 10 list for things around RAG and embeddings as a top level entry? Or do we more think that this is a pattern that we want to ensure is included in the right places in other entries in our guidance to make them modern? So I'll just put it out there and ask people to chime in, but do we want to invest in looking at a top level entry around RAG and embeddings, or do we want to ensure that it's well represented in other entries? Sandy.
I think we do a disservice if we try to add it into the top 10, because it's still a facet of AI LLM model deployment. It's not specific, it's not a part of the overall. I think if we try to boil the ocean, we're going to add more confusion. So I agree with you. Let's add it in as a component in the top 10, and then again, maybe it's another layer. I know we've had different discussions on the layers, but to me, the purpose and the value to what we do is we keep it simple, we keep it noise free, and one pager. This is what you have to do. This is what you got to be worried about. So anytime that we try to start making it bigger, then we add the level of complexity and make it harder for people to understand where to get started or how to do this stuff. That's just my thoughts.
Jason.
I think I was kind of leaning the other way, but I think you can abstract it more to just insecure storage of embeddings or data, or to include models is where I'm going with that, right? So how you secure your models and how you secure your embeddings databases and all of that, securely managing your storage, I think could be its own topic. I think it could also be wrapped up into the relevant other topics, right? So data poisoning and retrieval, insecure input for that matter with RAG.
Yep.
It's an input now as well. I'm not sure which is a better approach between breaking it up across a bunch of different other entries, or making it its own topic and including models and embeddings, databases.
Okay. Aubrey.
So I'm gonna say, I think that, so with somebody said that there may be something that comes along that's hot, in the future, and I'm gonna say really RAG is something that uses an embedding model, right? So if we maybe focus on the fact that there are threats that could come from embedding alone, really, I think the embedding portion is the threat. If we're talking about securing LLM apps, working with an embedding model is maybe its own category of threat.
Ads?
Right.
My personal opinion is the same as Sandy's. I think like RAG is a subset of an LLM API, LLM application architecture. So it should just be called out in the individual entries, like Jason alluded to, like excessive agency, sensitive information, stuff like that.
Yeah. Okay. Just checking the chat here. Okay.
I'll make a note to try and close this one out. I think we didn't see a submission in that 34 that was highly ranked that was exclusively around RAG and embeddings. It's come up as a discussion in the V2 discussion with comments like Bob's here. I think those are valid. I think they bring up a good point, but to some extent, if we were going to add something, it would have. I would have felt like we would do that if everybody here felt really strongly that we should do it, and it was an error that we had missed it. So I feel like from a process perspective, we would have had to break the process and go back and open it back up to put that as a candidate for the top 10. I don't hear that level of support for that. So my inclination is to say, as a group, the way that we're leaning is retrieval augmented generation, embeddings, vector databases, everything that falls into that category of a lot of really popular patterns for how people are building LLM apps are really important. They have security implications, and we need to make sure those are covered in our document, but that we won't kind of break this open and break glass and pull lever to do something to push it into the top 10 as a new top level entry. Any disagreements there?
No. I can't see how you can call embeddings or RAG a threat. That's just the way people do stuff.
Yep.
I do have a question for much smarter people, though, and maybe this is outside the scope, but I'm wondering if anyone knows if embedding will become a bigger part of, of SLMs. Are we going to need to, and again, we're not talking large language models here, but if we're looking at small stuff, will basically multiple small models be grouped via embedding models? Does anyone know the answer to that? No, they won't.
I don't know the answer.
You don't know? Okay.
Scenario. Maybe that's a scenario we can discuss in a follow-up as part of a thread. I think, what we're seeing today is the embeddings being used to help RAG.
For RAG, yeah.
That's the pattern that you see.
I just wonder what else will be, we'll use those to stitch things in. That's all.
Yeah.
All right. That is the end of the slides that I brought that were based on the discussions that I abstracted. And I think we are out of time. So we're going to have to run. Catch you all up later. Bye.
Thanks all. Thanks for checking out our bi-weekly meeting podcast. If you'd like to stay up to date on all of the latest news for the OWASP Top 10 for large language model applications, please click subscribe. And of course, we'd appreciate it if you'd share with a friend to grow our community. We'll see you in 2 weeks.